For decades, we told ourselves a comforting story. That war was receding. That globalization had tamed power. That violence was the exception, not the rule. But look closely at the world right now. Capital cities bombed, borders inflamed, great powers testing each other in plain sight. This is not a breakdown. It is a transition. In 2026, global conflict is no longer peripheral. It is systemic. It is normalized. And the most dangerous part is not where wars are burning hottest, but where they are being quietly ignored. I want you to pause for a moment, because what we're witnessing isn't just more crises. It's a shift in how the international system decides which lives, which wars, and which regions matter. If you care about how power really works in the modern world, this conversation matters. Stay with me. Because to understand where we are going, we first have to be clear about what exactly is breaking and why. And that brings us to the central question. What makes this moment different is not a single war or even a cluster of wars. It is the pattern underneath them. Conflicts are no longer isolated events. They are signals of a system under strain, forced to prioritize some crises while quietly sidelining others. In 2026, experts see a world where violence is rising on almost every axis at once. Interstate wars are escalating. Fragile states are collapsing in the background. And major powers, the United States, China, and Russia, are no longer just managing risk. They are generating it. This creates a brutal hierarchy of attention. Some conflicts dominate headlines because they threaten U.S. interests directly. Others, even when marked by mass atrocities, are treated as strategically tolerable. That distinction matters because it reshapes incentives. It tells governments which actions carry consequences and which ones do not. The result is not chaos by accident. It is disorder by design. To see how we arrived here, we have to step back. We need to understand the forces that have been quietly building for years, long before 2026 ever came into view. To understand this moment, we have to resist the temptation to see it as sudden. What we are living through is the accumulation of unresolved tensions. For years, the international system has been drifting away from restraint. Norms against non-aggression weakened, not overnight, but through repetition. Each escalation that failed to trigger real consequences quietly reset expectations. By 2025, that erosion became visible. Long-standing disputes reignited, old borders flared back to life. Interstate conflict, once treated as a failure of diplomacy, began to look like a tool of policy again. At the same time, internal wars in fragile states never truly stopped. They simply lost strategic urgency. As attention shifted toward high-impact threats to U.S. interests, conflicts defined by humanitarian catastrophe were deprioritized rather than resolved. This created a dangerous imbalance. Powerful states tested limits. Weaker states absorbed the costs. And violence, instead of being prevented, was triaged. What we're seeing in 2026 is not randomness. It is the outcome of choices layered over time. And those choices are about to collide with consequences far harder to contain. Then came the year when escalation stopped being theoretical. In 2025, interstate violence surged in ways that shattered old assumptions. Conflicts that had simmered for decades suddenly flared. Borders once considered frozen were tested again openly, unapologetically. Airstrikes hit capital cities. Not proxy zones, not remote frontiers. Capitals. From Eastern Europe to the Middle East, from South Asia to the Gulf, the message was unmistakable. Geography no longer guaranteed restraint. The symbolic center of states, their political heart had become fair game. At the same time, something else happened. As attention locked onto these high-impact confrontations, other wars faded into the background. Civil conflicts marked by mass suffering escalated with little international response. They were deemed likely but strategically manageable. This was the first real rupture. not just an increase in violence, but a reordering of concern. If you're trying to understand why today's world feels more volatile, more cynical, this is the moment to watch closely. Because once escalation becomes routine, it stops shocking anyone. And when that happens, the system begins to behave very differently. Which leads us to the deeper question, what mechanisms are actually driving this shift? Beneath the headlines, a quieter mechanism is doing most of the work. Risk is no longer being reduced. It is being managed selectively. In 2026, the dominant logic shaping global responses is not prevention, but prioritization. Experts are forced to ask not how to stop conflict, but which conflicts matter most to US security interests. That shift changes everything. When major powers are involved, escalation is treated as urgent. When fragile states descend into violence, even at massive human cost, the impact is judged lower. Not because the suffering is smaller, but because the strategic spillover is. This creates moral hazard. Actors learn quickly. They see where red lines are enforced and where they are quietly erased. At the same time, the United States occupies a paradoxical role. It remains the actor with the greatest capacity to stabilize crises, yet it is also increasingly a direct participant in them. Deterrence and disruption blur. Prevention and provocation coexist. This is how disorder sustains itself. Not through chaos, but through logic. And once a system starts operating this way, escalation doesn't need intent. It needs only momentum. Which brings us to the next rupture, when that momentum collides with real power. Momentum, once it meets power, doesn't slow down. It accelerates. By 2026, experts are no longer asking if major confrontations will intensify, but where they will break first. Several scenarios now sit at the edge of escalation at the same time. An intensifying war in Ukraine, driven by expanding attacks on critical infrastructure and population centers. A potential cross-strait crisis where China and Taiwan test limits with consequences that reach far beyond the region. And US military operations that risk spilling across borders, turning targeted actions into direct state-to-state confrontation. This is the second crisis point, because unlike earlier flashpoints, these are not peripheral conflicts. They involve actors with the capacity to redraw the global order. What makes this moment especially dangerous is compression. Multiple high-impact scenarios are unfolding within the same narrow window of time. There is less diplomatic bandwidth, less margin for error, less room to de-escalate once things move. In this environment, miscalculation becomes the true enemy. Not ideology, not intent, but speed. And when crises stack this closely together, even a system designed to manage risk can begin to fail. The question now is no longer abstract. It is personal, because the next layer of impact doesn't land on governments first. It lands on people. When analysts talk about risk, they often forget what risk actually feels like. For you, risk is not an abstract chart. It's higher prices. It's uncertainty about work, safety, and the future. It's the quiet anxiety that seeps in when the world feels less predictable than it used to. As global conflict rises, everyday life absorbs the shock. Energy markets tighten, supply chains strain, governments divert attention and resources towards security, away from stability at home. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people affected by these shifts never chose them. They don't live near the flashpoints. They don't sit at negotiating tables, but they pay the price anyway. You feel it when politics grows harsher, when fear replaces trust, when crises abroad slowly reshape the tone of life at home. This is why these conversations matter. Understanding the system is the first step toward not being blindsided by it. If this analysis helps you see the world more clearly, pause for a second. Stay with this series. Because what happens next doesn't stop at national borders. It spreads. What begins locally rarely stays local anymore. In today's system, conflict moves outward in waves. A war in one region distorts markets in another. A military escalation redraws alliances thousands of miles away. As tensions rise between major powers, smaller states are pulled into sharper choices. Neutrality becomes harder to sustain. Trade routes become strategic assets. Energy, food, and technology turn into instruments of leverage. This is how regional crises become global stress tests. The conflict in Ukraine reverberates through Europe's security architecture. Instability in the Middle East compounds humanitarian pressure and regional volatility. A potential crisis in the Taiwan Strait threatens the backbone of global commerce. None of these exist in isolation. They reinforce each other, and for the United States, this creates a strategic dilemma. Influence is everywhere, but so is exposure. Every intervention carries ripple effects. Every absence does too. The world we're entering is not defined by one decisive showdown. It is defined by accumulation, pressure building across multiple fronts, testing the resilience of institutions that were designed for a calmer era, which leads us to the hardest question of all. Not what happens next, but which futures are still possible. Looking ahead, the future doesn't narrow to a single path. It splits. One possibility is managed turbulence. Conflicts continue, but escalation is contained. Major powers pull back from the brink, not out of trust, but exhaustion. Diplomacy becomes transactional, imperfect, yet just strong enough to prevent collapse. A second path is normalization. Violence doesn't spike dramatically. It simply becomes constant. More crises, more interventions, less outrage each time. The system adapts not by restoring order, but by learning to live with disorder. And then there is the darkest scenario. Compression turns into collision. Multiple high-impact conflicts erupt simultaneously. Decision makers stretch thin, miscalculate. Deterrence fails not because it was abandoned, but because it was overwhelmed. None of these futures is predetermined. They are shaped by choices made under pressure, by what governments decide to prioritize, by which risks they absorb and which they ignore. History rarely announces its turning points in advance, but it does leave clues, and the clues in front of us suggest one thing clearly. The era of assumed stability is over. What comes next depends on whether we learn from that reality or deny it. We began with a question about conflict, but what this moment is really about is responsibility. In a world where violence is rising, the most dangerous illusion is distance. The belief that these crises are someone else's problem. That instability can be contained, that today's flashpoints won't shape tomorrow's lives. History tells us otherwise. Systems don't collapse all at once. They erode when warning signs are acknowledged, but not acted upon. The United States still has leverage, still has influence, still has the capacity to prevent escalation rather than merely respond to it. But capacity alone is not strategy, and power without foresight rarely produces stability. For you, the viewer, this isn't about choosing sides. It's about understanding the forces that are reshaping the world you live in. Because awareness is no longer optional. It's a form of preparedness. If this analysis changed how you see today's headlines, stay here. Share it with someone who still thinks this is just another cycle. And join me in the next conversation where we'll look at how societies adapt when disorder becomes the norm. The future is being written in real time. The question is whether we're paying attention while it happens.